Hi guys, keeping in with the theme of Eerie October and the idea of playing more horror-esque, kind of scary experiences during the month of October. I wanted to bring to your attention a couple games I think you might find interesting, games that are sort of suggestions for me to play during this month that aren't going to be your typical suggestions. A lot of people will go straight to just the pure horror, and you'll hear a lot of Fatal Frame, Silent Hill, Resident Evil. But maybe you're not into survival horror exactly, or maybe if you're into survival horror, you're only into those really mainstream series and you haven't picked up some of the more obscure titles. So here's a few that I would suggest playing that some are survival horror, some just have sort of an eerie, kind of creepy vibe to them that can fit in with players who aren't necessarily big survival horror fans, but still want that little bit of a horror atmosphere to go along with the month of October. We're going to start with a couple games I've talked about before on this channel. If you have a Sega Dreamcast, Carrier and Blue Stinger are both great alternatives to things like Resident Evil 2 and 3 on there, or Code Veronica. Both great games to check out if you are a survival horror fan. Carrier is definitely the better of the two, but if you're looking for a little bit more of a humorous time, check out Blue Stinger. It definitely has more of that B-movie horror vibe. One of the first reviews I ever did on this channel when I started last February was for Shadow of Destiny on the PS2 and the PSP. And now this is a good example of something that is certainly not in any way survival horror, but it does really have sort of a spooky, kind of creepy atmosphere, and the entire game plays much more like a nice, calm adventure game, but at the same time you're constantly escaping your death, you're constantly changing fate, you're battling, saving your life throughout the whole thing. And while it is sort of a calmer paced thing, it does have that creepy atmosphere where death could be around any corner going throughout the whole experience. And it's a great game for people that want a little bit more of a toned down experience but still want that sort of eerie vibe. A series that I really enjoy is Tecmo's Deception series. Here's one on PS1, Kagero, which is 2 on PS1. I'm missing 3. I've played it way back in the day, don't have that right now, but 4, Trapped, is another one I want to talk about, and specifically I want to talk about 1 and 4, because I feel like when a lot of people think of this series, and not a lot of people think about it, to be honest, they think of 2 and 3, they were the more popular titles, they were a little bit more in the public eye, and 1 and 4 I think get overlooked. And no, I'm not even going to bother trying Deception on the Vita and the PS3. It looks like they really took things into much more of a goofy, hyper-anime, comedic style, hyper-sexualized. It doesn't have that same feel. I mean, if you look at the first one here, which is one of my favorites, might even be my favorite in the series, it actually, visually, it's from a first-person perspective, which is, is the only one in the series with that perspective, and it's interesting. It almost has kind of a Kingsfield vibe to it. Very dark, very eerie. Trapped is another really good one I think is overlooked. And between those two games, the whole idea is somehow you are blamed for the death of someone, a king, or usually almost always a king, or a prince, or somehow you are fallen victim to circumstance where someone has created a plot in which you are the scapegoat and to take over the rule of a kingdom. And you have to make a pact with this fiend, with the devil, to get these powers to create traps. And instead of directly attacking foes, it's a lot of running and hiding from people and setting up elaborate traps. Sometimes one where you can set a trap and it knocks them into another, which knocks them into another and causes this chain of damage. And it's a really interesting strategic gameplay to this whole series. And it's fascinating because it has this really just very dark horror-esque vibe to it, but at the same time plays a little bit more like a strategy RPG. So there's a really great series, one I really want to look a little bit more in detail at a later date. But just one, if you know about it at all and haven't played the first or fourth one because they're overlooked, or if you don't know anything about the Deception series, go ahead and check it out. Probably don't start with that Vita one. I haven't had a chance to play it, but just from Let's Plays and reviews and looking at trailers and things, it doesn't look like it really represents the series. Check out these more with a better like horror vibe. Another one, if you have a PSP or Wii or a PS2, Obscure the Aftermath. And this is a sequel, but a sequel where you really don't have to play the first one. The whole idea of the first one is that this crazy professor created this plant that creates a pollen that drives people crazy and mutates people, and it feels like a very summer, B-movie horror film with a bunch of college kids, and story-wise is not very good, setting-wise is not very good, but it is actually creepy, and it's a game that I like more because of the gameplay mechanics. And I've played the PS2 version and a little bit of the PSP version, and I would like to check out the Wii one eventually. It's a really interesting game where you're constantly in pairs of these teenagers, and they all have different skills and abilities as you're working your way through all these puzzles surrounded by creatures. And the puzzles really work well because you can play the game one or two player, and you have to constantly utilize both of these characters to solve a lot of these puzzles. You can't really do it with one person. And I love the gameplay mechanics of it, and I feel like that's what takes this, what could have been just a very standard, dull survival horror game, to a level of complexity where it's actually pretty interesting and pretty fun. Not the greatest, but definitely a great find. The first game is much harder to find. It's a very obscure game. But the second one is easy to find. You don't really need to play the first one, so really great game to check out. It has definitely an interesting twist to survival horror that you don't always see. On the Nintendo Wii, a lot of people talk about Dead Space on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, but you have Dead Space Extraction on the Wii, and this is the same kind of Dead Space experience, but from the perspective of an on-rails first-person shooter. And it's a really great game, and it is kind of like playing the House of the Dead version of Dead Space, but it's much more interactive. You can actually do a lot more within your environment, and you have a lot more of a freedom of movement and things than you do in a lot of traditional light gun games. It's definitely one that would not have worked incredibly well in arcades. It's kind of that arcade experience of a light gun game brought home and really focused more on that home experience by giving you a little bit more interaction and choice and a little bit of a more lengthy experience. A really great spooky game for the Wii, and I believe it's an exclusive still for the Wii. One that's often overlooked is Run Like Hell for the PS2, and I believe the original Xbox as well. Run Like Hell is a really interesting game because, keeping in line with Dead Space, it's kind of like Dead Space before Dead Space. It was released, I believe, in 2002 for the PS2, and about a year later for the Xbox with, I think, an additional level and some extra character skins and things. It's a really interesting sci-fi horror RPG that doesn't really go incredibly over top of the horror, but really adds some more interesting gameplay mechanics, a lot of puzzle solving and running and gunning and shooting, and a lot of more of the sort of creepy going around environments. But one of the more interesting things is the running segments. Starting off in the beginning of the game, there'll be all these segments where you're taking, almost like when you do the reverse levels in the first Crash Bandicoot, where you're in third person running towards the screen and something is chasing you from behind, and it's an invulnerable enemy, and you have to make your way through a maze of, say, fallen beams and boxes and jump over and under and go around. And these running sequences break up the gameplay enough to make it really fun. And it's definitely, I think, a very underrated sci-fi horror game that's a short, maybe 10-hour experience, but really good, really fits into that October vibe, and it's one that's always overlooked. It's an easy-to-find game, super cheap. Definitely check it out if you have a PS2 original Xbox.
Come on. Amanda, you okay?
I'm fine. This can't be happening. Just get a hold of somebody.
Oh my God.
Nick? What is it?
Seven-letter word for long and hard. Starts with an A. What is this? I know this. What would be long and hard? Arousal. What does long and hard have to do with arousal?
Well, Harvey, if you don't know the answer to that by now, it's safe to say you never will.
Now, I'm going to have to disagree with Minx on that one. This is actually probably the funniest game I've ever played in my entire life. But not everyone gets the humor. My wife hates Harvey Birdman. She thinks it's so incredibly stupid. And maybe you'll think it's scary as well. The last two that I want to suggest are definitely Parasite Eve and Parasite Eve 2. Forget about Third Birthday on the PSP. That is more of it's a decent game, but it's definitely does not feel like Parasite Eve, and it's more of an action shooter than a true horror game. Stick with 1 and 2. 1 is still to this day the greatest example of a horror-themed RPG ever created. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Absolutely love this. If you've never played it, you must play it. If you like RPGs, check it out. If you like survival horror, check it out. It's great for anyone that likes anything with a sort of a horror theme. Parasite Eve is fantastic, and I was a little bit disappointed with the direction they took Parasite Eve 2. They took out the majority of those RPG elements. They still have a lot with her abilities and things, but they completely changed the gameplay. Instead of having that pseudo turn-based, in the environment combat system of the original game that gave it a little bit more of that RPG feel along with the horror, they went a little more with the traditional Resident Evil style gameplay, which is still good, still a wonderful game, and a really interesting experience, but definitely don't like it quite as much as the first game. First game is a little bit more of that horror vibe, but it was actually very impressive what they did with Parasite Eve 2, because it takes place in the desert. It takes place in a lot of very well-lit environments, and that's not something where you typically think you're going to get much of a horror vibe from, but they actually did a really good job. Those are probably my favorite horror-themed games ever created, so definitely check those out. Old school Squaresoft love, just fantastic on the PS1. Those are a bunch of suggestions of games that are often overlooked during this season of October. They're not the mainstay, Silent Hill, and they're not like even the mainstay old school games like Alone in the Dark and things like that. They're things that are a little bit different for people that maybe aren't straight survival horror fans. I'm usually not a huge fan of the genre. There are a few exceptions to that, but these are some games that are some suggestions for you guys to check out during this holiday season and enjoy yourself. Even if you don't like survival horror, enjoy some more spooky games rather than just straight scary games.